Linux Luddites, episode 75, for the 4th of April, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. And on this show, we put on some waders and step into the increasingly murky waters of Linux tech news. I'm pleased to say, stringently filtered for April Fool's jokes. We cover some excellent feedback received this fortnight, and then I try to convince my co-host that Mosh, an alternative to SSH, is the new sliced bread. And do you mind if I ask a quick question? So recently I got a laptop, and I have to say I'm fairly new to the laptop sort of world. I had a netbook a few years ago, but haven't really had anything. So the last 4 months ago, I bought a laptop. And so I've not actually got very involved with sleeping and hibernating. And I've been particularly pleased to see that the Fedora install I've got, Aurora actually, that we reviewed a few shows ago, does well. When you close the lid, it sleeps, and you open it up and it starts straight back up again. But hibernating, i.e., dumping to the hard disk, just falls over every time. It just does a full reboot. Is that like a known problem? Have I just ignored this and whenever people talk about it, not really paid attention? Or is Fedora not playing ball very well?
Well, I can't offer any insight, I'm afraid. I always just turn off machines because they've all got SSDs and boot quickly enough for me to not worry about these things. But I know you, Paddy, you're quite into your closing the lid and sleeping and whatnot.
Yeah, and it is sleeping I do. I've never tried hibernating within Linux.
Okay, I mean, previously I've only ever had them so that they close and go to a black screen, so you open up and they're straight there again. But the default I forgot to change with this Aurora install. And as I say, the closing the lid and opening it works absolutely perfectly. It's a Lenovo. But when it comes to selecting to hibernate so that I can, go on the train and open it up and not have to reopen all my tabs and various things that are running, it just does a straight boot as normal. Anywho, so if any listeners have had any experience of this or no particular workaround for Fedora in particular, that'd be quite useful if you get in touch. But let's get on with the news.
And first up is the news that Red Hat has become the first 2 billion open source company, which can definitely be only a positive news story, and not even you, Paddy, can surely say anything negative about this one.
I probably could, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, so their revenue for 2016 is 2.04 billion. So yeah, it wasn't that long ago that they were the first 1 billion open source company, and now they're doing even better than that. So it goes to show that there is money in open source. Even if there aren't that many people doing it, at least one company is doing it really well.
Yeah, there's money in open source for that particular business model. So they've got enterprise customers who want to pay for support, and they have enough people using RHEL that they get all this money. But, I mean, you look over the fence at Canonical, who arguably have a lot more installs on servers, on AWS and things like this, and they seem to be struggling to monetize it. So I wonder if there was a direct competitor to Red Hat, whether there would be enough space in the market for two competing companies.
Well, what about SUSE?
Yeah, well, what about SUSE is that SUSE does very well in Europe, thank you very much. I mean, Red Hat is de facto standard in the US, which obviously accounts for a large proportion of the market, particularly the US military and government. But SUSE does quite happily over here.
But they're not a $2 billion company.
No, but they're a several hundred million company. It's just a smaller market, that's all. I think Red Hat really had a lot of benefit from first mover advantage, if you like, in this space.
Yeah, I guess that's what I mean. They've built up a customer base, and they're now the one company that people think of, or one of the first companies that people think of. And it's going to be very difficult for anyone to catch up. But as things move towards open source, and we'll get onto that later in the news, it can only mean that more companies will have money, and news articles like this will be more prevalent, hopefully.
And now there's a way to get Red Hat without paying for it, because up until now, to get proper RHEL, you had to have a subscription and you had to pay for that. Whereas now, if you're a developer, you can get hold of it totally for free.
So what do you think the impact's going to be on CentOS?
Well, this is specifically for developers rather than people who want to deploy their own server. So presumably people will still continue to use CentOS as well. I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about where the split is. I mean, I've always got the impression, although there are some people running CentOS in production because they don't want to pay for support, that generally a lot of their user base are developers, and it's actually just for building things. And then when it gets deployed into a Red Hat environment, and they're using CentOS for compatibility purposes. And if there's no need for that anymore, there's no need for that anymore.
I don't know. I think there are quite a lot of smaller companies who have technical knowledge and don't need to pay for the support, but they want the robustness and the tried and tested OS that is Red Hat, and so they just go for the CentOS route.
Yeah, fair point. I think it's probably worth pointing out as well that this free RHEL developer subscription you're talking about is also providing all of that support, so you are going to get patches throughout the lifetime, just as if it was a paid subscription.
Does this mean we can finally have a look at it then? Because we're too cheap to pay for it.
But that means that we'd want to have a look at it, Joe.
Ah, well, I like to try everything. At least once.
Moving on swiftly. Come on, Mr. Jesse.
Moving on to the other behemoth in the Linux world, and that is Debian. And they're up for their annual project leader election. And the current project leader, Neil McGovern, is stepping down after 1 year in the job. And they currently have one candidate who is standing, Mehdi Dougui. He's a 32-year-old Tunisian French living in Paris, and he currently works for EDF. And if he isn't elected, then the option is to basically go around this process again and hope that someone else stands, or that everyone changes their mind and then elects him. So we'll have to see how this all falls together.
So the question is it a good or a bad thing that there's only one person standing? It depends if you're a half full or half empty kind of person. The positive spin is they're so unified and happy as a community that they're all backing this one person. And the kind of negative view is that only one person wants the job because it's such a poison chalice.
Does it also not depend on there may just not be many people who are there in the right time and place in their career to feel that they can stand? I mean, it doesn't say a lot for the democracy that's in Debian if there's only one person standing, but I do sort of get your point, Joe, that perhaps actually this isn't the greatest job in the world. And, you know, the guy who's stepping down has only been in it for a year. He could quite happily put his name up for nominations again. So it does look a little bit dubious that the current guy is stepping down after 1 year and there's only one person standing. Well,
I'm sure we'll be back in a future show to announce that coronation. Moving from Debian to Ubuntu then. Well, sort of Ubuntu. And Ubuntu BSD has got a lot of press in the last couple of weeks, and the first 3 betas have now dropped. And this is based on Ubuntu 15.10 Wiley and the FreeBSD 10.1 kernel. It comes with a XFCE desktop. It's supposedly designed for both servers and desktops, and offers ZFS out of the box, as you would expect with it being FreeBSD based. I haven't been able to get this running at all, even in a virtual box. Joe, you've had more success, I gather.
Yeah, no success from USB. And by that, I mean, I tried DDing it and that didn't work. So I gave up and burnt a DVD. And I spent a fair bit of time with Beta 2 and was, I don't know, I got it working and that's about it, really. You can't really do much with it once it's installed. I mean, you go through the Ubuntu Minimal installer, only instead of being the beautiful purple color, it's a beautiful pink color. So that's all very nice. And it doesn't play nicely with other partitions. So you pretty much, once you've installed this, that's the only thing you can boot into. So I would not put it near a production machine if I was you. And it's the same story for me for Beta 2 and 3. Once you get it installed, well, during installation, you've got the package selection. So to say it comes with an XFCE desktop, I don't think is correct, really. It comes as a minimal installation, and you can choose things like LAMP stack or a desktop if you want, but the only desktop that's available is Ubuntu desktop, which, being a Ubuntu user, was quite appealing to me. So I just selected that. And you get it up and it is more or less a Ubuntu desktop, except that you can't do any updates because most of the repos that it's pointing at are 404ing, which is a bit strange. And anytime you try and do anything with Thunar, it just crashes, or at least Thunar does. So you can't even take a screenshot and save that because it just doesn't like it. And if you try and export something from GIMP, it just crashes as well. So it's incredibly rough around the edges, but it's quite a cool concept, I think. And I think it's more aimed at the server type stuff, really, because ZFS doesn't make a huge amount of sense on the desktop, I don't think. Whereas in a server situation, it makes much, much more sense. And so I didn't really get a chance to fully test that. But if you want stuff like ZFS and don't want any potential controversy, then this might be the way to do it if you're familiar with Ubuntu and you like to use apt and stuff rather than the port system. So it's an interesting project, but I don't think it's ready by any stretch of the imagination yet. I think that it's more alpha than beta, to be perfectly honest.
Given that it's called Ubuntu BSD, does that mean it's got official blessing from Canonical?
No, it hasn't. And hearing Popey talk about it suggests that it has nowhere near blessing from Canonical, and it really ought to be called something with remix in it, or it oughtn't to be called Ubuntu BSD, because that implies, as you have asked there, Jesse, it implies that it's official, and it's not an official flavour at all. So they may get into trouble, but I don't know. I don't think it's kind of good enough to warrant getting a cease and desist just yet.
Yeah, I was surprised by your, overview, let's say, and how ropey it sounds, because I sort of got the impression that this was a backup that they could fall onto should the whole ZFS sort of issue become a point where Canonical has to back down and doesn't include it. But it does sound like this is more of maybe a toy project, sort of an interesting thing to do and test, rather than actually something that Canonical are trying to get working for when they want to have ZFS around the place.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know, a toy project, I know I've never heard that before, but something along those lines. Someone just tinkering. I suspect it's only one person behind this, just tinkering and just doing it for the sake of doing it. I don't think there's any serious... well, it might be serious, who knows, but I don't think Canonical have got any involvement in it, put it that way.
Well, I've definitely heard of Debian on BSD. Isn't that... Why aren't they just using that? That's a thing, isn't it?
It was a thing.
Ah, okay, so they tried and it fell over.
Yeah, I'm not aware that development's ongoing. It may well be, but there's nothing happened recently that's brought it to my attention. But yeah, you're right, it did used to run atop a BSD kernel. We'll be coming back to Ubuntu userland sitting on top of other people's kernels somewhat later in the news. But for now, let's move on and talk about another strange new OS, and that's Redux OS. And this is a Unix-like operating system written entirely in Rust. If Rust passes you by, this was a language that was developed by Mozilla, and it aims to be safe and concurrent and practical for all sorts of use cases, generally systems programming though. It prevents a lot of the possible pointer and memory problems that coders tend to overlook when writing in C, for instance. And although Rust 1.0 only came out last autumn, it obviously has been considered mature enough to write this operating system in, which I think some of us would probably query. Redux itself is aiming to be a microkernel system, but it's still got some way to go to pull various bits out into user space. What do we think about this, guys? Do you think this is a nice addition to the OS space, or were we struck by some of the slightly confrontational language, shall I say, on their website?
You're talking about in their book, that they call it, which is the documentation for this. I'm not sure, really. I'm always for choice. And I'm never going to say people should not do stuff, but I have no interest in running this, at least yet, because it's so embryonic. I mean, much like the Ubuntu BSD project that I talked about, I wouldn't mind trying it, and I did try this, but it just didn't work for me, and I didn't have enough time to really spend on it. But I like the bit about licensing in their book. And they talk about why they use MIT rather than GPL. And I've never read such a concise and well-put argument against the GPL, I suppose. and for permissive licensing. But it very much sums up a lot of my feelings on the issue. That, what if someone steals your source code? Well, if they make it proprietary, then it doesn't really matter. You've still got your thing, haven't you? And if they did make it better than yours, then maybe you should make yours better.
Yeah.
The other big difference with Redux OS is that they are on a microkernel rather than the monolithic that Linux uses. And sort of one of the negatives that they charge with Linux with is that because it's this monolithic kernel and it keeps compatibility with lots of old hardware, it therefore gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it has all these drivers and things that just sort of bog it down, whereas with a microkernel you can be a lot more nimble. But the problem is looking at it from the other side, one of the things that makes Linux good and usable on a lot of hardware is that it has so many drivers. It's so usable with old hardware, which maybe other operating systems have dropped and moved on. And so you can, we always say you can breathe life into old hardware. So it sort of works in both. But I suppose if you're going to make an operating system from scratch in this day and age, you wouldn't really be thinking backwards. It's just because Linux has come from long ago, let's say, and it's worked its way through those. I get the impression that these guys are saying, right, we're here now, how are we going to move forwards? And there are some real benefits with using microkernel.
Oh, there certainly are. And the thing that came to mind when I was reading about this was Minix, which, going back to the phrase used earlier, some people still consider a toy operating system, although it's certainly not. It may have started life as a teaching system, but is now very much usable in production. And that obviously is a true microkernel. But they never had any success in the userland space, so they ported over the NetBSD userland. So we've got a whole bunch of sort of mashed up operating systems and userlands going on at the moment, and it is making for a very interesting space for us to watch.
Yeah, let's not forget about the herd as well if we're talking about microkernels.
Yeah, okay. Lastly then, in the queer stuff this week, Stally has been released as an ISO. It's been around for a little while, but this 34 megabyte ISO is now downloadable, and it provides you a basic command line system. And if you've not come across Stally, this is a project headed up by Anselm Garb, who's the guy who wrote the DWM window manager. And like that window manager, the whole project is under the umbrella of Suckless, who also provide a whole bunch of similarly simple command line tools, including a terminal emulator called ST, which is actually very good. And I saw Greg KH once praising. There is no package manager in this system. There's no systemd, and it uses a modified file system layout. The main thing about it, obviously, is that it is statically linked completely. Everything within the operating system is statically linked. Now, that obviously removes dependency hell, but potentially opens it up to security issues when you have multiple packages needing updates that aren't receiving them. I mean, what do we think about static linking, gents?
Well, I don't know. You've mentioned the security aspect there, that you have to update these libraries in every single binary rather than just updating one library and having everything pointing at it and using it. But at the same time, you also mentioned dependency hell, and the fact that it's kind of Windows style. You download this one thing and it's got everything it needs to run. And it's more towards that kind of containerized way of doing things. So I can see the appeal. And in this day and age where disk space and bandwidth are much less expensive than they used to be, it kind of makes sense. But I'm just more used to the old system of doing it with dynamic linking. So I don't know. That's a bit of a fence-sitting answer, but I suppose that's where I am on the fence about it.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I mean, you mentioned containers there, and people are very much going down that route, and we're going to talk about application packaging a little bit in the feedback later on as well. But I think potentially static linking works well in this case because Suckless are famous for sort of putting out nice, small, efficient, not that often changed tools. And in that case, you've got time to work all the bugs out, sort out all the security issues, and then you should be able to leave a binary alone for years and years, and for it to still work in exactly the same manner years later.
But if one of the libraries does need to be updated, does that mean that the library gets updated and you can't update the library? You have to update all of the different binaries. So it's again based on the package manager, the person who is producing that binary, to update it and get you to update that.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, it sounds like it has the same flaws that we discussed, I think, in the last show, to do with the containerization and the various ways in which, while containers seem to be secure from one point of view, if you have to update every single application that uses one library or one shared something or other, then you're relying on the people who are producing all those applications getting off their asses and updating it, rather than just that one library, which is probably from the main repo. I also don't really understand how these are smaller. I mean, one of the things that they've talked about Stally Linux is that it's very, very small. But if you're having to include multiple libraries into every single binary, surely that's going to make it bigger.
No, not necessarily, because you're only including the bits of the library, if you like, that you're actually using within the application, rather than having some huge, great big dynamically linked library floating around just in case people want to use bits of it.
Right, yeah, you can be far more picky and chop it up into little sections. Gotcha.
Yeah, and static linking is fairly common in the embedded space, where you look at fairly small footprint boards. And it does remove the dependency issue and the problem with breaking dependencies.
Yeah, and dependency problems is something that reared its ugly head in the Node world this week, when there was a little bit of a legal issue with one Node module in the Node package manager. And after a bit of a hoo-ha about that, the developer of that one module pulled all 250 of his from NPM. And one of them, LeftPad, which is a very small, I mean, it's only a handful of lines of code, was depended on by so many people that it just caused chaos, to the point where Laurie Voss, who is the CTO of NPM, actually unpublished the LeftPad, kind of put it back in so that people would actually have working systems again. And it really goes to show that when you have all these dependencies, you can have issues when something goes wrong. I mean, it might not necessarily be caused by a human, in this case, caused by a bit of a row. It could just be more of a technical issue. But when you've got so many different applications depending on this one module, you can just have these serious problems like this.
Yeah, so the fallout from this is that NPM have changed the way in which they allow people to publish on there. And if you're an author of some code and you're allowed 24 hours in which to take it down and edit it, perhaps you notice there are flaws in it or security issues, and that's your 24 hours to do as you will. But after that, it is then required for NPM to approve removal of that code so that they can have more control over what's going on. Basically, they've tried to get a way out of this happening again by, having a disgruntled member of their community pulling everything and causing some issues. And the way the article is kind of written is a little bit sort of look at this fragile state in which it is and look at all the various bits which are put together to make all of these applications and JavaScript and things work. But I sort of look at it from the other point of view, and this is simply a discussion of standing on the shoulders of giants. And now, while the piece of code we're talking about here is very small, no one blinks at using something that someone has done in Linux or some other bit of software and pull it into theirs, saying, why am I going to write something to do encryption from the ground up? Of course I will use one that someone's already done and tested. And so this is just a version of standing on the shoulders of giants. And sometimes that means that these things fall over. So I don't know, I'm not really sure that this is that big an issue to do with the way in which this code is structured. It's more to do with the way in which NPM managed their people and had some flaws in the way they were working with the people that are producing the code for them or that they host.
The one thing I don't quite understand here is that if NPM is a package manager, then surely it pulls down the packages to the local machine wherever you've got your Node application running. And so why does deleting something from that repo have such a huge effect? I mean, it would affect updating it, but surely it'll still be running locally. Was this just an issue for new deployments, or have I misunderstood how this Node package manager works?
Well, from what I see, it's for when people build against it. So they've got a list of dependencies that they need in order to build their packages. And so it wasn't affecting the end user, it was affecting everyone who was trying to program using all of these packages before they then ship them out. So it's not a problem for the end user, it's a problem for all the developers and people that are building JavaScript and various other things that Node's used in. So shifting gears somewhat, and we often talk about various cities and districts who are moving over to open source, and normally open source office suites. And the latest one in this sort of chain is Nantes, and they have moved over to LibreOffice starting in 2013 and following the procurement guidelines set out by the French government. And they think that overall they'll have saved 1.7 million euros when you take out all the various factors for paying for Microsoft licenses and things. And this includes 600,000 euros that they've put aside for staff migration and training, and another 200,000 euros they've put aside for new code and bug fixes. And I think this is a really good sort of pot of money to have, because they're accepting that while it's taken them a long time to slowly transition people over and that costs money, they also understand that there isn't a one-to-one like in LibreOffice as compared to Microsoft Office. And so they've given a couple of examples of things that they would like to see coded into LibreOffice and which this pot of money will go towards providing. So graphs in pivot tables, and there's some problem when importing HTML into Calc. And so it seems like quite a success story from the point of view of, targeting a money-saving thing, i.e. moving over to LibreOffice, which I think is something that the French government are pushing all of their, certainly governmental citizens to do. And also the fact that they've accounted for differences and put some money aside from it. So it sounds like the right way to do these sorts of things.
It definitely sounds like the right way to do these sorts of things. I mean, surely this is how open source should work. Rather than spending money on proprietary software, especially government money, public money, it should be spent on open source software, free software, and it should be spent on improving that software. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. They're giving the Document Foundation money to further develop something that is free open source software from which everyone else will benefit. It just seems like this is exactly how we should be doing things.
Yeah, as you touched on, they've been quite specific in saying that they want to make sure that any changes they make are pushed upstream so that everyone can benefit from them. And these are the sorts of departments who are really pushing office suites to the limit. They've got finance departments and they've got planning departments and things that are using each of the applications within that suite more extensively than your average Joe will. Sorry, Joe. And so being able to put that up and make sure that it comes out in the next release so that everyone benefits from it should accelerate it no end. And if more departments were using this and more governments had this attitude, then the rate of improvement of, for this example, LibreOffice, will be significantly faster than it is now.
Yeah, I think that was an incredibly positive story, and it's good that people are recognising that free software is not necessarily free as in beer, and the benefits accrue from when you do actually spend a little bit on it. Well, staying in France, ad blocking is crippling income to some media organisations, so they're looking at preventing users running blockers accessing content. And they're asking people who are trying to gain access to their websites to either subscribe to get through a paywall or just turn off their ad blockers so they're actually forced to see the adverts they want them to see in the first place. In August, most Swedish publishers will also be doing this, and the French have already started doing a trial. I found that out fairly recently because I went to go and look at some football news on a couple of French websites and found that I was blocked because I'm running uBlock Origin. And this also happens in the UK, and again, I've got personal experience where you need to disable ad blocking to access some of the television catch-up services. Now, we'll be coming back to ad blocking later in the feedback, but this really is turning into a bit of a war, isn't it?
A war? It sounds more like a death rattle to me, this sort of stunt. I mean, what are they possibly going to achieve by blocking people's access to content? People aren't going to say, oh, okay, I'll turn my ad blocker off. They're just go elsewhere and find content from people who are willing to put up with it.
I don't know, aren't they going to turn it off? I mean, if there's a known website that you go to all the time for a various thread of news and you suddenly can't get there, you might think, well, it's only this one website. I'll disable it for here or add it to my whitelist, for example, and then you never have to think about it again. And so you can still get that content. It's just that you have to put up with it. And maybe it'll get to the point where you get so annoyed because that's the one website you see with loads of ads, and you might think, well, actually, I will discount this one entirely from my library and find an alternative source, which is what you're saying. But I don't think it's that difficult to just whitelist one or two if you're ingrained in using them.
Except that often that is not enough. Just whitelisting the page or the domain or anything, it just isn't enough. They detect that you have that running and block you anyway.
Yeah, and it's also not just the odd site. I mean, the backstory to this, particularly with the Swedish initiative, is that it's going to be virtually all of the print media online presence. I mean, they're talking about 80 to 90% of them will be doing this all at the same time. And I noticed the French media, it's a huge chunk of the popular French press have started doing this as well. And I guess by doing so, I mean, if it was just the odd site, you'd probably say, okay, I won't bother using that. I'll just use something else instead. But if everyone's doing it all concurrently, they're taking away that choice and really forcing you to think about whether you actually want to be running an ad blocker at all.
So you think it might work then?
I think it's got far more chance of success when they do it as a shared initiative, if you like, which is obviously the reason they've come up with this.
Well, it's not just the fact that people want to not see adverts that they use in these ad blockers. I think that a big factor is trying to avoid being tracked by these ad networks and ad agencies that put up adverts for things that you've looked at on totally different websites. And so people are becoming much more aware of privacy and anonymity. And one of the ways they're doing that is with Tor. But that doesn't always work out very well if you're trying to view Cloudflare sites, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cloudflare is sort of a top-level DNS and also has a bunch of the websites cached. And if someone from the Tor network is going to view one of these websites, which, as you say, goes through Cloudflare are putting them onto a number of captures. So basically, a lot of the traffic that Cloudflare, or at least from Cloudflare's point of view, they've assessed a lot of traffic from Tor is flagged as malicious, either coming from bots and spam or going to sites which they shouldn't be, or various flavors of that. And in order to deal with this, they're sending users to captures to try and filter out any of these automated or traffic from bots. And the problem is because of the way that Tor switches its exit nodes, it can look like the same person is coming from multiple places. So if you change the website you want to look at and move on to something else, Cloudflare doesn't know that it's the same person. And although they will have already, done a capture to prove that they're human, they'll think it's a new device and therefore they'll send it to another capture. And basically it's got to the point where if you're using Tor and you're going to a load of these websites that Cloudflare is involved with, you will be getting a capture every single time you go to a new domain, which has got to be unbelievably annoying. And it's sort of flared up a little bit between the Tor project and Cloudflare, with some posts about how Cloudflare are not making it easy for people to use Tor.
And I've actually tried this. I downloaded Tor and I went to some sites that I thought were using Cloudflare, and sure enough, you're faced with these captures, which are fairly straightforward, but it takes a long time for the images to load, and you've got to pick the ones that have got road signs in or whatever. And you're there clicking for a couple of minutes before you can even see the website, which is just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, surely there's a better way of avoiding spam and malicious activity on Tor than these ridiculous, numerous captures over and over again.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Because you have to prove you're human for this to work. And Cloudflare have come up and said, okay, let's us implement some sort of system that's client side, so you can prove you're human once and then it's passed back to the CDN next time you access a website on that CDN. But the Tor people aren't very happy with that because that impacts on the privacy and anonymity aspect.
Yeah, it sounds like it entirely undermines the anonymity aspect, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I think people are wanting sort of to have their cake and eat it here.
Yeah, it does sound like the way in which you solve this is to reduce the anonymity, i.e. make sure that on the web people know that you're a human, but by doing that, it is in direct conflict with the whole point of being on the web and not people not knowing who you are. So it does sound like there's going to be a huge clash. But Cloudflare can't be the only company who are seeing Tor traffic as a new device every time, a domain or a wget or something is done. So I don't understand why they've got all the abuse. Are they just the biggest player in this market and therefore Tor are directing their anger at them? Or are they unfairly filtering Tor traffic? And this is potentially where the guys from the Tor project are getting wound up, is that Cloudflare have decided that all Tor traffic is malicious and therefore pushing it all down the capture route.
Well, it kind of all comes down to a trade-off, doesn't it, between anonymity, privacy, and convenience. And it's kind of like the good, cheap, fast thing. You can have two, but not all three. But the bottom line is that people don't really understand about this stuff anyway, on the whole. Certainly, according to various studies, including one that you've linked here, Paddy, which is almost shocking. If I didn't have such a low opinion of humanity, then I might be shocked by it. But people are saying that the darknet should be shut down. And, just ridiculous stuff like that. It makes you shake your head, I think.
I think it's a reasonable point of view for people to hold if all they know about the dark web is what they see in the mainstream press, though. I mean, it's a bit like climate change.
Don't be starting to deny that on this show, Paddy. You'll get us too much feedback.
Okay, let's stick on the tech side of things then. I mean, yes, and this is a fair-sized survey. It's not one of those where they asked a couple of people down the pub. They went out and quizzed people in 24 different countries, 1,000 people in each country, and came up with some, as you say, fairly horrific numbers for people who just want it all shut down.
Well, why do people want it to be shut down? Because the media would have you believe that it's full of pedophiles and terrorists and drug dealers and all that kind of evil stuff. And I suppose, I don't know, maybe there's a bit of truth to that.
Yeah, I guess the actual use case for, like journalists and people who really do need secure, anonymous communication, it's relatively small in the scheme of things, and people just don't take on board that it's a perfectly reasonable use case.
Yeah, it is a small use case, but as you say, it's something that if you don't need it now, but you can't say, I will never not need it, and it becomes quite difficult to define which side of the fence you sit on, depending on whether your government or not changes. And from that point, there's a really interesting graph showing what percentage of the people from each of these countries that was asked are strongly against their national security agencies reading their communications. And while countries like Great Britain, Sweden, Indonesia are down around sort of 20% of their population saying that they do mind the amount of communication and personal information that our security agencies are gathering on us, South Korea, Hong Kong, Turkey, Japan, and Germany, all up around 45% of their citizens saying that they do mind. And I just sort of wonder, the contrast for me there is the difference between Germany at 45 and obviously Great Britain at 20. And it just sort of is a good graph to show, while everything might be tickety-boo now, you don't know how you might work your way up or down that graph depending on how governments change and things. But once the allowance for the survey state is made, it's very difficult to take a step back. And it was interesting to me how those different countries have quite a strong difference of opinion as to whether or not they want their government to be surveying them and looking at all their communications.
Yes, I wonder how people's opinions will change in the States once President Trump enters office.
There is still hope. It may not happen yet.
It's definitely going to be Hillary. You heard it here. Well, you didn't hear it here first, probably, but that's my prediction. Definitely Hillary.
Yeah, that's a far more frightening proposition, to be honest, I think.
What's with all the politics on this show, Paddy? Honestly, come on.
All right, let's take it back to tech then. And staying on the sort of security aspect of things, there's an Android routing bug that's reared its ugly head. And the story I'm going to link to in the show notes is ostensibly about a vulnerability present in all Android releases that use Linux kernel version 3.4, 3.10, and 3.14, which apparently includes all of the Nexus phones and obviously lots of handsets from other major manufacturers. And once an app has gained elevated privileges, there doesn't seem to be any way back short of reflashing your ROM. The thing that really got me about this particular story was a little bit of a quote that came in it, and that is, "The flaw which allows apps to gain nearly unfettered root access that bypasses the entire Android security model has its origins in an elevation of privileges vulnerability in the Linux kernel. Linux developers fixed it in April 2014, but never identified it as a security threat." Now, we talked about this in the past, about how Linus likes to do things and just mark a bug as a bug and not as a security bug. But this just kind of brings home again the sort of double-edged sword that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that it's going to make life easier for people downstream. Well, clearly it hasn't, given this vulnerability. But I just wonder whether it makes life easy upstream, i.e. where Linus and the kernel is coming from. It can't be any more difficult or problematic to flag these as the correct type of bug. And surely it will look better from Linux's point of view if we are able to say in this release of the kernel there are 15 security improvements. You know, it sort of looks good if you're able to actively say that you're securing your kernel.
Yeah, and in this case, in fairness to Linus and the kernel team, there was a CVE for it, and the Android guys at Google didn't pick up on that and didn't implement the changes either. I don't know, it's just a confluence of events perhaps, but it did bring to mind the fact that security bugs don't get flagged as security bugs.
Well, yeah, and it also illustrates what we were talking about on the last show, that these phones are not using mainline kernels, and certainly not modern mainline kernels. They get this ancient kernel, patch it to, oblivion, where it's basically unrecognizable. And that just means that it's very difficult to implement these updates.
Well, that's all looking backwards and some existing phones and the Android M. But there's some new stuff coming up in Android N now, isn't there, Joe?
Yes, very exciting things. Android N's freeform window mode, which Android N's only in preview at the moment, only on certain devices, none of which I own. Grr. But if you do get it running on one of your devices, you can use this freeform window mode, which is essentially like what we talked about with the Remix Mini, which is proper windows that you can move around and float on top of each other. There are some issues with it. It's not working 100% yet, but it's still in preview, so you wouldn't expect it to be fully working just yet. But it's certainly a very promising move forward that means that you can potentially use an Android phone as a proper computer, and coupled with outputs to screens, whether that's wired or wireless, you've potentially got proper convergence here.
Yeah, I'd take slight exception to that, because to use a desktop as a proper desktop, I would expect there to be a taskbar there, and I would expect Windows to be able to be moved around and put into window mode without having to go through all the palaver of going into the window switcher thing.
Oh, yeah, and I think this is just a step towards that.
So it looks like on this preview, where you have your normal home screens on your Android device, if you decide to make an application windowed, it will pop onto sort of a new additional home screen that just has your desktop background or your home screen background, and then the various windows on top of that. And like you say, Paddy, there's no sort of taskbar in order to select which one you want. So by all accounts, it's a bit of a faff to try and select the windows and resize them and things. And they've integrated some things. So, for example, mouse support is there, but also when you select which application you want to look at, normally there's the app picker, is it? Like where you have them all stacked behind each other. And this will split in two. So it'll have the standard sort of cards in a carousel, so you can pick which application you want from all the standard Android apps. And then a second level with the little sort of semi-notification of the windows which you have. You can pick which ones they are. So clearly some things they've sort of thought through and decided how they want the different applications, whether windowed or not, to be picked. But as you pointed out, Paddy, there's obviously not actually a full desktop going on yet. But we've sort of seen this move to, if we're going to call it convergence of Android, with Chrome OS allowing Android apps to run on it, and now Android sort of going towards a window kind of mode. And they are bound to, in the next year or two, merge in the middle and have a Android and Chrome OS kind of clients, aren't they? It's just got to happen.
Well, there are enough other people actually coming out with something very similar at the moment, aren't there?
Yeah, I mentioned the Remix Mini, and there's Maru and Andromium. There clearly is a desire for this. Where how many people are actually interested, who knows? But I know I certainly am very interested in this. So I really hope they develop this further, and maybe in the one after end, it'll be fully functional and have a taskbar and all that kind of stuff.
What kind of sweet dessert can you think of that begins with an O?
Oreo.
Oreo, yeah, absolute sponsorship opportunity, yes.
Well, we haven't had the debate as to what Android N is going to be called yet, so let's not get ahead of ourselves. But switching over to GoDaddy, and they're launching sort of a DigitalOcean kind of droplet style infrastructure. So GoDaddy are a hosting and domain registrar, and they have about 14 million small businesses in its user base. And all they're doing is hosting their websites, and they're going elsewhere if they want to get things like, cloud infrastructure or the other benefits that DigitalOcean provide. And so GoDaddy have realized they're missing out on some money here, and they've actually recently acquired a cloud division of a company called Aptix, and they are very, very similar in the way that DigitalOcean is structured, whereby you pay by the hour up to a limit for the month, and you can spin up and spin down instances. So it looks like they are joining the bandwagon, as it were.
Yeah, we've spoken about how we host with DigitalOcean, and we've got our affiliate link, linuxluddites.com/DigitalOcean. Cha-ching, check that out if you want hosting. And it just goes to show that they're onto a winner here. If you've got a behemoth like GoDaddy come along and essentially copying their product exactly down to the exact numbers in a lot of the cases there, it means that DigitalOcean must be doing something right.
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, GoDaddy span this as an alternative to Amazon Web Services. I mean, that's what I saw in all the press releases about it. But it is a DigitalOcean or Linode rip-off, basically, they're doing here. And that's fair enough. I mean, GoDaddy don't really have the best reputation in the tech world. They've had slightly poor customer services and support for many years. But I guess it all comes down to sales when you're dealing with small businesses, and you only see what the publicity tells you.
Yeah, excuse Paddy's funny accent. That was poor.
Oh, sorry, poor, yes. Anyway, we mentioned at the top of the show Ubuntu BSD, which was a slight oddity, and it probably won't have escaped anyone's notice that Microsoft Build has been on in the last few days. And it probably won't have escaped your notice either that there was a huge announcement there, which has received, lukewarm reaction at best, I would say, amongst the Linux community. I must admit, I'm really interested and quite excited about this, and to see how it's been spun by people and the amount of negative comments I found really disappointing and slightly immature. And we're talking about, of course, Ubuntu user space running under Windows, actually running on top of the Windows kernel.
Yeah, we're talking about in Windows 10, you just open an application and boom, you've got a Linux terminal, which is running Ubuntu. At the moment, 14.04. They've got plans to implement 16.04 as soon as they can. And from there, you can do everything or almost everything you can in a Linux terminal in Ubuntu. And so you've got apt and, all of the command line tools that you would expect. So it's kind of pretty good if you're forced to use Windows, but you want to be able to do a bit of compiling code and development, and you're used to the way Ubuntu does things. There's nothing as exciting as getting a desktop running, certainly exciting to me at least. That would be quite funny to get kind of an XFCE desktop running on top of Windows. But I can see why people are being very negative about this, because it's the whole embrace, extend, extinguish thing. And, how many times, how many shows recently? It's like the last 3 or 4 shows we've been talking about Microsoft in our news, because they are getting into this open source and Linux world. And now they're cozying up with Canonical. I mean, that is very worrying to me. I'm seriously thinking about setting up Manjaro and getting used to that, because maybe these predictions about Microsoft buying Canonical may be correct, although I still think that it's not going to happen. I think they're going to work together rather than actually buy them.
Right, well, you're kind of expressing a view I've seen fairly widely about this. I mean, I've seen a lot of blog posts with people writing Microsoft with $signs and the usual sort of
Yeah.
immaturity. Why would this upset you if Canonical and Microsoft were doing business together and it ended up in providing a working environment that people found useful and actually brought more people into using the Linux environment, albeit not running on top of Linux?
Because just association with Microsoft makes Canonical look dirty. I mean, don't get me wrong, I understand why they're doing it for commercial reasons, much like why Sanogen Inc. Doing deals with Microsoft, because that's where the money is. But it still does not look good for, diehard freedom lovers, which is, I suppose, questionable in my case, but still, people who care about FOSS. I don't want to use something from a company who is dealing with Microsoft, and Microsoft have not changed. They might talk about loving Linux and for very understandable commercial reasons have started to embrace it, but that still doesn't change the fact that they're an evil proprietary software company who I want nothing to do with.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously very much about developers and Azure, I think, at the end of the day. And the amount of developers that Microsoft have lost to the free and open source world, and also to Apple. I mean, a lot of devs, even working on Linux, actually run Apple systems. I think they're trying to drag them back and get them using the web tools from the command line. Well, the bash prompt, actually, on Windows.
One thing I found pretty funny was that you open it up and there's not a $sign there. It's a hash. You run as root. That's just the Microsoft answer to everything, isn't it? Just run as root.
Oh, I'm finding this really uncomfortable because I'm sat here defending Microsoft, if you like. They have said explicitly that this is just the first iteration and the user accounts will be added. But yeah, I know. I'll take your point, though.
But it is just bash, isn't it? I mean, Joe, you're talking about running XFC and things, but the view I had was that they'd basically taken all of the commands that you're going to have in bash and all of the back-end system calls that it's making and just have a huge translation into what the Windows equivalent is. Now, the problem I have with this is that the only command I can think of is CD in a normal Windows command prompt. And obviously that's exactly the same in Linux, so that's a stupid argument. But for example, maybe ls is in fact dir, isn't it? There we go. So if you type in ls, it'll just do a dir and then give you the answer back in the bash prompt. And obviously there are some translations to go back the other way as well. But it's not to the point where you'd be able to actually run visual sort of window, X windows and things like this, is it?
No, very much not. They've said that that's not going to happen. Well, that's what they're saying at this stage anyway. But no, it's all about basically just being able to compile code and use command line stuff.
Yeah, I mean, these are actual Linux native ELF binaries we're talking about. So you can run GCC, for instance, and generate a Linux binary whilst running under this environment on Windows, and it'd be identical to as if you were running on Ubuntu on a Linux desktop.
Okay, so it is more integrated than just a sort of translation then.
Well, I've seen it described as a kind of reverse wine, but it feels to me almost deeper than that, the integration.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, we have to remember that even going back to the NT days, there was a Unix layer there as part of the kernel, and this is part of the kernel. Now, questions have been asked about how much this is only supporting Ubuntu, and there's no reason why it would as opposed to other distributions, but Ubuntu is the only one that is running at the moment. But yeah, it's kernel side. It's not like a shim layer, which is how some people have been describing it.
So I suppose the question is, what is the wider point here? I've alluded to it. Are we talking about Microsoft genuinely using Linux to try and make some more money? Or is it a case of them trying to extinguish Linux by embracing it first? Why is it that we're talking about them in the news every week?
Well, my view is it's very much about developers, and it's about making Windows an attractive platform for developers so they stay there no matter what they're developing. I mean, if you're writing web apps, you could do that quite happily on Ubuntu on top of Linux at the moment. A lot of people do. But if you can stay in Windows, then you can start tying in services that are provided by Azure. And this is about driving developers to use Azure.
What, driving them away from AWS to use Azure?
Yeah, because the cloud is where people are going to be making money in the future.
Well, that's what they keep saying. On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to our new monthly supporters, Steve Edwards, Christopher Hudson, Lars Falk Peterson, and Nikolaus Power. Very much appreciated. And of course, to our existing monthly supporters, we couldn't do this without you, as we say every time. So thanks a lot, guys. And contact details in a strange font that Paddy's put in here, which is both uppercase and lowercase at the same time. Let's not get distracted by that. So you can email us, show@linuxluddites.com, or you can find us on Twitter, Linux Luddites, or if you go to the website, you'll find links to the Google Plus and Facebook communities. And of course, you can leave a comment under the relevant post for each show.
On the last show, Joe mentioned FOSS Live 2016, which is happening down in London this August. And there are still some tickets available for that, I believe.
Yeah, there aren't many left, but there are a couple. Linux Voice forgot to mention it on their podcast, so as soon as they do, they'll probably sell out, I would have thought. So yeah, this is Saturday the 6th of August 2016, and it's going to be a free evening of Linux podcasts. That's how we're selling it, and it's going to be Linux Voice, Ubuntu Podcast, us, and a kind of mashup show at the end that's going to feature Stuart Langridge and Dave Megaslippers from Geek News Radio, and possibly some other people as well. We'll have to see how that goes. And it's at the Harrison, which is 28 Harrison Street in King's Cross, and doors will be opening at 5 o'clock and finishing at kind of pub chucking out time, 11 o'clock, I think. So do come along. It'll be good fun. Still not sure about OggCamp happening this year. It's looking not that likely, so this is a good excuse to get together and do the kind of social bit of OggCamp, I think, where we just get together in a pub. It's worth mentioning, I didn't mention last time, that it is adults only. It's in a pub, and so we can't be having under 18s, unfortunately. But do come along. If you go to fosstalk.com, then you'll see all the details on there about the venue and where you can get tickets from Eventbrite. It's free to all. But we've got tickets because it's quite a small venue. So do register for a ticket and hopefully see you there.
Yeah, I know you mentioned a mashup there, but I've been to your website previously, Joe, and it's referred to as a drunken mashup on the website, isn't it?
Yes, it is. There'll be a lot of alcohol happening, I suspect.
Well, before we get into the feedback proper, we did get an email from Panu, who was requesting that we sort of rearrange the way in which we write our show information and the number of the podcast. So can you just run through what that was, Paddy?
Yeah, he was just pointing out that in some podcatchers and readers, you don't actually get to see what the show is about because they trim down the description so much. So I've taken on board what he said, and I've rearranged things a little bit so the timestamps and the segment information is front and centre. So hopefully anyone who's suffered from this also will find that a refreshing change.
Yeah, and hopefully it'll look better in iTunes as well, because I looked once and I don't know, they didn't seem to be displaying it properly, but hopefully that's all good now. So let's move on to the proper feedback then and start with some KDE love. And Simon got in touch to say, I've always been in full agreement with you guys when it comes to KDE. Every time I've had the misfortune to try it, I came away feeling totally bemused and wondered why I just did that to myself. However, it's been quite a while now, and I was rather inspired by your interview with Jonathan, so this evening I wiped Cinnamon off my main Arch box and stuck Plasma on there. Wow! I was fully expecting it to look pretty these days, and indeed it does. But I wasn't expecting it to be so simple to use. All I've done so far is add my icons to the panel, and it's just great. Even tricky things like a Windows app I run under Wine went happily to the panel, and even integrates itself into the system tray when delivering notifications. Not something I was expecting to work under KDE. So it seems that Jonathan's sales pitch worked, in this case at least, with Simon.
Yeah, despite your two's best efforts to poo-poo KDE, it seems to have come off well. And I have to say, I had the same sort of experience as Simon. With KDE 4, I was always just couldn't understand the weird blue border and the way it was set up. It felt a bit clunky, and the fact that you had that little box on the desktop that you could put some shortcuts in, like, why do I want a box? Just put them on the desktop. It was just a bit odd. And the argument that you can tailor it and tinker with it to make it exactly how you feel does hold some water, but you do want it to be sort of nice out of the box. And this is why I always appreciated distributions like Mint would sort of go out of their way to make it a bit more consumer friendly out of the box. But Plasma 5, I've got to say, I've been really impressed with, and it's quite an elegant desktop environment, as Simon says.
Yeah, and the up-to-date Neon version that we talked to Jonathan about has started to be delivered, so you can actually get ISOs for that for the developer edition from the website now. And Blaine also got in touch about KDE and said, in the 4.x versions, the defaults were just abysmal and looked atrocious. Plasma 5 has fixed all that, and the Breeze theme is gorgeous. The KDE team has even made Breeze GTK themes, so no matter which toolkit you're using, it all blends seamlessly. If you're looking for a great Plasma experience, I recommend trying OpenSUSE Leap. No, it isn't Ubuntu, and some things like VLC require you to add the Pacman repo so that it gets all the codecs, but it has been the most solid Plasma 5 experience I've used so far. One of the reasons I've been really happy with Leap is that even though it's a distro that focuses on stability using a SUSE core, it isn't afraid to upgrade components like the Plasma desktop.
I'm basically coming to the conclusion that there are more and more ways to have some things being stable and kept, in a known position, and other things changing. So, there's always the argument of why would you use Ubuntu over Arch as classic examples where one's rolling and one is every 6 months, and maybe going further than that, why would you use an LTS over Arch? And the problem is that they're both extremes, aren't they? If you use the LTS, you're really stuck with very few updates to a lot of the packages, whereas with Arch, everything rolls from the base system all the way up to the applications, and it becomes a bit of a potentially difficult to maintain, let's say. And I'm seeing more and more examples where the base system is kept stable and just the packages are updated, or vice versa. The base system is rolling and the packages are kept stable. And so there seems to be more and more areas in which you can be picky about what you want to be stable and what you want to be rolling, and whether you want to maintain your system very closely, or whether you just want to let it be but accept that you're going to not have the very latest that's out there. And I hadn't realised that Leap was doing it in this way, so it's good that Blaine got in touch there and just brought that to our attention.
And Sid Vicious said, I think Jonathan is right about Linux on the desktop. The average user is put off by so many choices, so many package types, package managers, and so on. Even updates are non-simple, so the Linux desktop ends up being rather scary. Your average punter doesn't want choice. They want their hand held for everything to simply work. The whole mess that is dependencies is a hell that people don't want to deal with. I think that containers will alleviate a lot of this. I also think that an App Store style container repo, for lack of a better word, will greatly benefit your average user. Being able to simply download and install a software package without worrying about dependencies is a huge step in the right direction. Becoming more Windows-like, or having that option at least, is the only path for the Linux desktop to gain more widespread use. It needs to be simple enough for my Ma to use without calling me, and most distros are simply not there. Which I would take issue with a little bit. I think that the average person using something like Ubuntu or Mint can install stuff from the repos via the graphical package manager and not even understand, not even care about dependencies. They just install the thing and it works. And certainly with Ubuntu Mate Software Boutique, it does it all in the background for you. So I'd take issue a little bit there, but I think the overall and underlying point does make sense.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Ubuntu Mate Software Boutique as we were going through that post, and it has sort of abstracted it a little bit further than maybe Mint and Ubuntu's graphical user interfaces for installing, because rather than typing in, for example, video player and being returned, 8 or a dozen results because there are, multiple ones that you might want to choose, a lot of people don't want that choice, as was covered in the post. And so actually what the boutique has done is say, this is the one that we think has the functionality and the look and the feel that we want, and this is the one that we recommend. And a lot of times I think they are sensible options. So people like Sid Vicious's Ma, who maybe want to install something, will just simply pick the one which is suggested, and it will very much meet the needs that they might have.
Yeah, and also, as we touched upon when we were talking with Jonathan, there are a couple of other factors here. I mean, software developers don't necessarily want someone standing between them and the end user. And we've currently got a situation where all these distros have got their own package maintainers, and that slows down the process, and they also get to decide what goes in and what doesn't. And they also make some strange choices by way of dependencies and also how packages are put together, So rather than an upstream just providing a rounded package that the end user gets, the package maintainers of the distros make alterations. I mean, for instance, we use Exim, and how Debian has Exim set up by way of configuration is different from how other distros do it. So it slows the whole process down, and it also prevents the end user getting the experience necessarily that a piece of software is intended to provide by the original developer.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, but that does make sense for these self-contained packages to be delivered to the end user as the original developer envisaged them, basically. Well, moving on to SyncThing, and Ian Barton wrote in saying, do the Luddites have a particular reason for not talking about SyncThing? It does more or less exactly the same thing as BT Sync. It's open source and it even updates itself, so you don't have to rely on your package manager. And on a very similar vein, Dennis got in touch saying, with all the talk about how necessary a BitTorrent sync replacement is, I completely missed any past reviews of SyncThing. I assume he's talking about on our podcast. I completely replaced 5 or 6 instances of BitTorrent sync with SyncThing a year ago, and have had nothing but great luck. I threw an Ubuntu server on an ancient box that just sits in the corner as an always-on peer, and now even see my spider oak usage as simply a redundant safety net. So just to make clear our coverage on these things, in 37 we looked at OwnCloud, Pidio and Cfile, which, while they don't exactly mirror what BitTorrent Sync and SyncThing do, are useful applications in themselves. And we did look at, or Paddy and I looked at a couple of very simple synchronization programs in episode 52, but we've not actually looked at SyncThing. So why is that, guys?
Well, certainly from my perspective, it's previous experience with it. And I said this to Ian on Google+. I've always experienced excessive CPU use with it. And also it seemed a very unnecessarily complicated setup. Now, I understand why they go about having to enter the identification keys at both ends, because theoretically it's more secure. But if you're using a large enough key space, that is not a problem you want to be worried about particularly. I don't know. I guess probably what we need to be doing is going and having a look and see where it stands today.
Yeah, that's how I feel, really. I have used BT Sync a long time ago, and that seemed very, very easy. And my understanding, my ignorant understanding, was that SyncThing was rather more complicated to set up. But I think that it's one of these cases where we probably should try it before talking about it.
Well, we'll do that then, and report back on a show fairly shortly.
So on the topic of paying for content, John wrote to us to say, the proliferation of ad blocking software has more to do with a desire to avoid being profiled and tracked all over the internet than it has to do with viewing ads at all. Everyone would be right to protest against strangers physically following them around all day, recording everywhere they went, everything they purchased, everything they looked at, everyone they spoke to, etc. People wouldn't put up with this kind of harassment in person, so it's no wonder they won't put up with it online either. Advertisers should have no right to conduct this level of intrusion, and individuals have every right to protect themselves from digital stalking. Content on the internet can still be funded by advertising, but the ethical way to do so is the same way print media always did it, by simply placing ads relevant to the published content. Ads can be put on pages with topics relevant to products, or on pages where it is expected the target demographic is likely to visit. This can be done without the kind of stalking and data collection that would make the worst totalitarian governments jealous. The internet needs a business model that can respect the privacy of individuals considerably more than it does now. What I would like to know is, minus ubiquitous profiling and tracking, could that model still be ad-driven? And that's kind of how adverts started out in the first place, didn't they? Before we had this sophisticated tracking and all that kind of thing, it was just whatever the content of the page was, that's the kind of thing that would be advertised there, which seems far less egregious to me. If I'm looking at a certain type of site and I see related adverts, then I don't have a problem with that. But, you know, when you go and buy something and then you're seeing adverts for it for the next 2 weeks everywhere you go, that's the kind of thing that drives people to ad blockers.
Yeah, and you're saying how things used to be. I mean, apart from the fact it was not specifically targeted advertising, in the olden days, adverts were actually served from the site you were on. It's the networks of advertisers that really have caused all this tracking and privacy invasion to occur.
Yeah, and it's the fact that people get freaked out or weirded out by the fact that they were looking for something, for a few days to research a holiday, and then suddenly, like you say, Joe, all of the adverts they get are for that holiday. And that is what then triggers the realization that something in the background is being more nefarious than they thought of. I mean, perhaps you go to certain websites and the ads don't really seem very relevant, but when the ad is incredibly specific, you realize there's no way that it's been randomly picked. This has been served to you. And I can't think of a single instance where anything I've looked at on an ad, I've clicked on thinking, oh, this is for me. It's far more likely that I'll think, oh, I need to do something about my ad blocker because they are tracking me everywhere. And this is where things like Privacy Badger come into play.
I can think of one example where I clicked an advert and used the product. And that was, I used to be part of a forum many, many years ago that was one of those freely hosted ones. And there was an advert on that for shared hosting. This is long before the days of DigitalOcean and stuff like that. It was just kind of cPanel shared hosting. And I clicked through that and ended up using them for years, about 5-6 years. And that's because that was a relevant advert. Whereas if it's totally irrelevant or, as we said, if it's tracking you, then there's no way people are going to click them and they're just going to block them with ad block. So to me, the solution is regression here, because what must have happened is they started using these networks to make it more efficient and more profitable. And in so doing, it's evolved to the point where they've now shot themselves in the foot because people are blocking them. But if people like Google went back to the old way of doing things where it, instead of scanning you, the user, it scanned the page and found keywords and put, if it's a camera review site, put adverts for cameras on there, then people might go back to actually clicking on those adverts and buying things and making the system actually work.
I don't think I've heard such useful and crisp, insightful information from you in a long time, Joe. I'm on board. Let's get that. Let's make that happen.
I think that's what they call a backhanded compliment.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, man. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on then and return back to talking about TV licenses and
TV tax.
Okay, TV tax. And Cal Eklund got in touch and said, how can you even think that it's bad if there are big media producers that do it for the love of money? You aren't forced to consume or purchase their content. The fact is, they will only make a profit if they manage to cater to the viewer's taste. If they produce content that nobody wants to watch, they will become bankrupt.
Yeah, fair enough. Can't argue with that. This is clearly addressed at me because I was the one who's saying that I don't care if this big content goes away and we end up with independent media only. So yeah, I can't really argue, but carry on.
Okay, Kelly did carry on. If the BBC's content is so good, don't you think people would pay for it willingly in a free market? Just as people do for services such as Netflix, HBO, Spotify, etc. I don't understand how the argument, big productions cost a lot of money, can be a fair defence of the TV licence. I mean, if people would pay for it by their own free will, why even have a mandatory TV licence? But, on the other hand, if the TV owners don't like the content and don't want to pay for it, why even produce it and have the mandatory TV licence to fund it?
Well, the fact is that people are willing to pay for BBC content. BBC Worldwide, the profit-making arm of the BBC, makes a lot of money selling things like Doctor Who and Top Gear and stuff like that. So at least some of the BBC content people would pay for, but then the minority stuff like Radio 4, there's no way that would be profitable. So I don't know. I don't know where I stand on the whole TV license thing. I'd just like to consume BBC content and not pay for a license, please. And not have adverts either.
I will, and I do willingly play my TV license. As you covered there, Joe, it's not just the TV part of it that the BBC does. It also has a huge number of radio stations, and all of that content is broken down and released as podcasts. And I think half of my podcast must be various BBC Radio 4 or comedy programmes or sort of excerpts from nuanced little BBC local radio stations and things, and they are everywhere. They're very prolific in this country, not only as a national broadcaster but as local broadcasters as well. And you get all of that, and so I, for one, would willingly pay and do.
Yeah, but isn't that the argument that you're willing to pay for it, and that's fine? But if I don't wish to support your habit of listening to very dodgy Radio 4 comedy in air quotes programs, then why the hell should I?
We'll go and watch the trailer for the new Top Gear, and you'll be, banging on their door to give them some money. It looks wicked.
Oh, not with that ginger word I can't say. So ending the feedback with a suggestion from Mark for a product for me to watch live TV. And this is from a company called WeTech, and it's called the WeTech Play, and it's an Android-based box that has Kodi pre-installed, and it will do IPTV, and it's got DVB tuners and stuff in there. But looking at it, it's kind of over €100, and it's a little bit expensive. But in the meantime, in between recording the last show and this one, I started experimenting with the Remix Mini, which I ended up with after we reviewed it. And it turns out that it's got everything I need. It's got audio out, it's got the built-in Wi-Fi, and with a combination of Kodi and the ITV Player app and that kind of thing, I've pretty much solved the problem. It's not quite as HD as I'd like it to be. 1080p would be nice, but given that I don't have to buy anything else to do it, I think that's the solution to my problem. So that'll do it for the feedback then. Let's move on. I don't suppose there's anyone listening to this who's never at least tried SSH out. And for me, it's something I use all the time into servers and indeed machines on my local network. But SSH is pretty old and tried and tested, I suppose you might say. But there is an alternative to it, a modern alternative called Mosh. And Jesse has been trying it out. And I think you're quite enthusiastic about it, aren't you? So sell it to us, Jesse. Go on.
I don't think I'm going to need to sell it to you. I'm just going to explain it, and you'll see.
Oh, it sells itself, yeah?
It sells itself, yeah. I mean, I'm just relaxed here. It's going to be easy. So, as you said, SSH is the secure shell, and Mosh stands for the mobile shell. And the real big selling point here is that you can change between networks, you can lose network connectivity, and it will carry on working once it picks up any network connectivity again. So that is the huge selling point, and where SSH and Mosh really differ. So it's released under GPL v3. It's at version 1.2.5, and on my Fedora box, that's what we've got. Raspbian is a little bit older, and the reason I'm going to bring up Raspbian is because that's my my test bed, if you will, because as you'll know, if you run SSH, you have a client and a server, and so you have to make sure the server is installed on the machine that you want to SSH into, and it's similar for Mosh. In fact, Mosh uses SSH, so when you first start up a connection, it will connect over SSH. You'll type in the password for the machine you're SSHing into, although, if you've got the keyring, then it will go straight in. And it then, while SSH uses TCP, what Mosh does is it connects over SSH, triggers the Mosh server on the remote machine, sends a packet back to the client, which says, okay, we've connected, we're going to now switch to UDP, and it then closes the SSH session, and your client talks to the server over UDP. And this means that, assuming you've got your firewall set up appropriately, it will make sure that it always goes to the same UDP port, it'll always go to the same address, and it can connect no matter where the connection is coming from. So a typical use case would be, I'm sat in my house on my Wi-Fi, I set up a Mosh connection, and all it is you replace the SSH command with Mosh. So Mosh space pi at blah, blah, blah. And it goes external to come through the UDP from an external address into my Raspberry Pi. And I can use it as if I'm SSH'd in. It's exactly the same, you're using the terminal on that server machine. I then walk outside and my Wi-Fi goes down. It connects to the standard data allowance on your phone, and it seamlessly switches over, so you can carry on without having to reconnect, without losing any of the information in the terminal. It literally looks exactly the same. So if you were to then go onto the tube, for example, and you'll notice this is my use case. A little banner comes up at the top that says, "You've lost connection," hold on, sort of thing. Basically, it will come back when you get some connection back. And this is the big difference. Whereas SSH will just stop, and you don't see that it's stopped. You have to sort of, bash some things in the terminal, and you wonder what's going on until you realize that your Wi-Fi is down or you've, lost connection somehow. It just falls over. Mosh will say, "Hang on, wait for it." And when a connection is found again, it reconnects instantaneously. It's so quick. You don't have to type anything. It's just straight back in there.
Okay, so you've kind of sold it to me here, but what kind of concerns me is that it has to go out to the internet and back into your network. So this isn't just purely of your local network then. I suppose it can't be.
Well, it can be. So you can just type in mosh pi at and then your 192.168 da-di-da, and it will connect absolutely fine, having done an internal SSH link first, as I described. But then obviously when you leave your Wi-Fi, it falls over, as SSH would, because it's lost that path.
But then if you come back to your network, it will reconnect seamlessly.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose the benefit I was trying to get was the fact that on your laptop, you can use your Wi-Fi at home if you've set it up the way I described with the port forwarding on your firewall and things. Put the laptop to sleep, go to the classic internet cafe or whatever, open it back up again, and it will reconnect. So yes, you're right. You can connect over your Wi-Fi without going to the external web, but you are losing one of the biggest selling points. You might as well just SSH otherwise.
As far as I understand, it also does some clever sort of buffering things, because with SSH, obviously, you're getting keystrokes echoed back to you all the time, and if you've got a horrible connection, that's really painful. But I believe with Mosh, you can sort of be merrily typing away, and it sort of syncs up eventually, but you're not having to wait for a reply from the server for every keystroke you make.
Absolutely. So the way that SSH sort of, my understanding of SSH works is that when you type something, it has to go to the server, get registered, and what the server sees, as you will, from that keystroke is then sent back to your local device. And that round trip for both the input and the return output is very long. And like you say, if you've got a poor connection, i.e. you're out and about or you're somewhere where the Wi-Fi is a bit sketchy, maybe a conference or something, it can really take a long time. You can type and not see anything on your local device because it's having to do this long round trip, get confirmed by the server, then come back. And the way that Mosh works is the commands you type on your local machine, on your client, are seen on your client and sent. And what the server does is send back confirmation that what has been typed is correct. So, for example, maybe the internet is very poor and you're quickly typing out a command. It is guessing that the keystrokes you're making are appearing on the screen as you're making them. And so it underlines all of the guesses it's made. So you get this little underline mark over any letters which have not been confirmed by the server. In the background, it's sending those keystrokes off to the server, and the server is sending back what should be seen on the screen. And when that is correlated, it will say, yep, what you've typed there is correct. You're showing it correctly. And it will sometimes make amendments. So, for example, I typed out quite a long command, and I made an error. So I just held the delete key and it deleted my entire command and carried on deleting my command prompt until a second later, the server came back saying, this is the result of holding the delete key, i.e. you obviously stop at the command prompt. But Mosh doesn't know that. It just assumes what will be happening. And so it does this predictive text and then confirms. Now, there are certain special characters which it doesn't predict. Enter, tab, the ones where the result has to come from the server. It can't guess what's going to be going on. But the ultimate sort of end of this is that when you're typing, you see everything you type and you feel like you're typing in real time, but all it's doing is then confirming it when it gets a chance. Whereas with SSH, you can be typing and nothing turns up and you feel like you're sort of maybe typing into the ether a little bit, aren't you?
That's a pretty good sales pitch so far, Jesse. It's got to have some downsides, though.
Okay, yeah. So if you're looking for a shell which you can move from multiple different connections, whether it be Wi-Fi, your home Wi-Fi, someone else's Wi-Fi, or just data allowances, it's perfect. There are, however, things that SSH does which Mosh does not mirror. It doesn't do port forwarding, and it doesn't do X forwarding. And I've actually been tripped up on the X forwarding a couple of times because a lot of my Raspberry Pis are headless and I want to look at the result of what they're doing in a window, and I'll Mosh in and realize that I can't do anything with that. You have to, close the connection and SSH in with an X forward. And so, yes, there are very, very good use cases if you're looking for a mobile shell, as it's called, but there are a couple of caveats which are you have to go back to use SSH for.
Yeah, I believe it doesn't support Screen or tmux yet either.
Yeah, I think you're right. I read that as well, but they're not things that I use particularly often.
Well, for how most of us you tend to use SSH, what you said sounds very appealing, to be honest. I mean, is it available across multiple platforms?
So in Linux, it's available. I just did a DNF install Mosh, and it's there. As I said on Raspbian, it's there, and it installs both parts, both the client and the server in one go, whereas with SSH, they come separately. And when, obviously, as I said, I've been roaming around and I've implied that I've been using my phone, and there are two ways in which you can use your phone to connect via Mosh. Now, one way is using Juice SSH, which happens to be the one Android application that I use anyway for my SSH connections. And so all you do is you set up a new connection, and there's a drop down, and you can select whether you want to use SSH, Mosh, other various ways of connecting. And so you set that up, and also input the information for your firewall that allows the UDP connection. And the other application which you can use on Android is ConnectBot. Now, it doesn't actually come as standard on ConnectBot. You have to install a separate APK. So it's IRC, the terrible pronunciation, but it's IRC ConnectBot. And basically, it is exactly the same as ConnectBot in even the way it starts and everything. And all he's done is there's a drop down where you, again, select whether you want Telnet or SSH. And he's added Mosh as an option there. So if you're familiar with ConnectBot, it looks exactly the same, and it just adds that allowance for that connection. And they are, as far as I can see, the only two ways of having it on Android. It looks like it's in all the repositories for all the main distros.
Yeah, and for those poor benighted developers we were talking about earlier, it is also available on OS X. There isn't a native binary for Windows, unfortunately, but you can install it into Chrome running on Windows, and that works quite fine.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for reminding me. I put the application onto my Chromebook as well. And the same way that there's an SSH client of some sort that pops up in a tab, exactly the same for Mosh. So really is available on nearly every platform. And the list on their website has got BSD and all the others as well. So all in all, I think it's really, really useful. It's fantastic for being able to leave the house and continue having a connection without having to reconnect. And the fact that it predicts what you're typing, so it feels like a much more fluid way of using a connection, makes it a really pleasurable experience. And I hope I've sold it to you.
It sounds like a rare case of change being progress. But with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or at the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
It's all right, Luddites.
See you later.